Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. I am your host, Eric Bjornstad, and I'm your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. This podcast is for anyone who uses fuel or who has things that use fuel, and that means whether that's at work or at home. And that means it's pretty much for everybody, especially for anyone whose job requires them to take care of stored fuel because they need that fuel to get the job done, whatever that job may happen to be. So if you think that any of that sounds at least a little bit like you, then the Fuel Pulse Show podcast is definitely for you. So, what are we going to talk about on today's episode? Well, if this is your first time joining us, you've kind of hit us in the middle of a discussion that we've been having on something that is really gaining traction among people who have to take care of stored fuel. And that is the subject of in-field microbial testing. So this is part 2 of our discussion because last time in part 1, we talked about why microbial testing is important, and we talked about some of the options that are available out in the marketplace for professionals to take with them and test where they're at instead of having to do things the old way by packaging up and mailing a sample to a lab and then waiting 3 weeks to get their results. So in the last episode, we asked, why is testing important? And the answer was because it's the best way to confirm what kind of problem you really have, which then enables you to actually make the right decision to solve that problem. Now, what options did we talk about last time when it comes to microbial testing? We started laying out the 3 major types of in-field tests, and we really spent our time talking about the first 2. Number 1 was culture tests. Number 2 were what we call lateral flow transfer devices. And we talked about the pros and the cons of each of them because nothing is 100% good or 100% bad. Everything's got good points about it, and everything has at least one bad point about it. And we need to be familiar with these test characteristics to know which one really is right for us. So culture tests, as we talked about in the previous episode, culture tests come in a bunch of different forms, but they all work by regrowing whatever microbes, bacteria, molds, yeasts, whatever microbes happen to be in the sample that you're testing. But culture tests have some problems in that they take a long time to deliver their results. Some of the culture tests are not that easy to interpret the results that you get. And then in the end, the culture tests just are not very accurate and not very reliable. And we talked in a little bit of detail about why that was. The second main type of test that we talked about in the previous episode, the lateral flow transfer test. We mentioned that the dominant trade name for these is a product from Conidia Biosciences called FuelStat Resonate. And the FuelStat tests work by having you mix your sample with some extraction fluid in a dropper bottle. And then you take the dropper bottle and you put drops of your preparation into a test slate that looks remarkably like a set of 3 pregnancy tests. So they have little wells. You put drops into the wells, and then you wait not days, but minutes. And you get your results back listed as either low or medium or high microbial content. And we judged the FuelStat tests, the FuelStat LFTs, to be a significant step up from culture tests for several key reasons. You get the results back in minutes instead of days, which is really important. You get results that are specific to types of or classes of microbes. You get one result specific to bacteria and one result specific to molds or yeasts. And this is instead of having results for just total microbes together. And that can be useful for some kinds of people doing this testing. And we also said that getting results back in low, medium, or high readings That's better than having to figure out what a bunch of microbial growth on a culture dip slide means, for example. But on the con side, we did also point out that LFTs have some downsides. And those downsides led us to this overall conclusion that they are better than culture tests, but they might not be the best option in total. For the fuel sat test, the results are, unfortunately, they are surprisingly easy to misinterpret. You make a mistake, and the results themselves don't cleanly translate in comparison to the results that you get from other kinds of tests. So they are difficult to use to do, say, trend analysis over time if you ever have to switch from or to a different kind of microbe test. The results that you get don't really cleanly compare. And the fuel stat tests are temperature sensitive, so it's easy to mishandle them, which deactivates them, which basically throws money away. So those are the things that we covered in part one. This is part two of our discussion, and this is where we're going to get into a third major kind of microbial test. And this one we think is really good, and we're going to call this ATP testing. Now, let's talk a little bit about what ATP is. Those of you who remember from high school or college biology, you probably know the answer to that question. But for those of us who who don't remember those classes, even if we took them, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. It's a type of molecule that's used in cells for energy transport and energy production. And all living cells have ATP. You cannot have a living cell without the existence of ATP being used within that cell. And so ATP tests rely on the principle that all living cells have ATP. Therefore, if you can somehow isolate that ATP and then measure the amount of ATP in a given sample, you can almost measure, quote unquote, the amount of microbial presence that's in the sample. Now, we said measure, we used air quotes. We said measure, but with ATP tests, you're not actually measuring or counting the microbes. What you're doing is you are measuring the amount of ATP in there, and that principle works because the ATP is an indicator. The amount of ATP that's in the sample is an indicator of the presence of something that's very directly tied to them, which is the amount of microbial presence in the sample. And all of this makes ATP tests different from lateral flow transfer devices. In LFTs, your results come from the amount of antigen that the test detects. It doesn't come from judging the amount of microbes themselves either. So, how do you measure ATP? Remember, we said if you could isolate the ATP and then measure it, you would get a very good idea of actually how much microbial presence is in the test. But then, how do you measure the ATP? Well, in the different forms of ATP tests available, you basically extract the ATP from the microbes, and then you put that into a tube. Usually, that tube will contain some kind of holding liquid. So you use something to extract the ATP from the microbes. Typically, you use a reagent called an extraction fluid. And then that liquid, which now will have the ATP in it, goes into a holding tube. And so then you take part of that liquid and you combine it with an enzyme called luciferase. And you combine both of these usually in some kind of apparatus, whether it's a holding tube or for highlight pens, it's a pen apparatus. So you put them both together, and then you put both of those into an optical reading device called a luminometer. And what the luminometer will do is it will expose the combined sample to ultraviolet light. And what happens is when you have ATP molecules in the presence of this luciferase enzyme, and then UV light shines on both of those, what happens is there's a chemical reaction that happens. And that chemical reaction causes photons of light to be produced. And this light, this is called bioluminescence. And the more ATP you have, the more of a chemical reaction you're going to have, and the more light, more bioluminescent light is going to be produced. And what the luminometer does, not only does it shine the UV light on it, but then it also detects how much light is produced in response. And so it will detect this light and it will tell you how much light there is, which can then be calculated, put into basically a conversion formula, and that helps you calculate how much ATP and therefore how much what level of microbial presence was in the sample. So that's the basic way that ATP tests work. And if you remember how we talked about culture tests and then fuel stat lateral flow transfer devices, it should be obvious that what we're talking about here with ATP tests are a whole nother level of technicality, a whole nother level of technical substance to the test. We've gone up another level, so to speak. Now, there are a couple versions of the ATP tests that you are likely to see when you go looking for them. And you started seeing these maybe about 15 years ago. So the first ones that you saw are what they call the ATP pens. Now, there are different trade names for these. The original ATP pens, what we call first generation ATP tests, those were developed by Merck. And then they were licensed to be sold by other entities. And so, one common one that you find out there, I believe, is branded by Sigma Aldrich and is called the Highlight pens. So the ATP pens were the first ATP tests, in-field ATP tests that were developed. They're the ones that you are most likely to have seen out in the marketplace. And so to do an ATP test with that kind of system, you take your prepared sample, you mix it together with a solution that contains this luciferase enzyme, and you put this into this pen like looking apparatus, and then you insert the pen into the luminometer. The luminometer reads it, shines the UV light, reads it, and gives you a reading of the amount of light back in units that they call RLUs, relative light units. Then you can take those RLUs and you can convert it to amount of ATP and then to amount of microbes. So the ATP pens are the first generation ATP tests. But a little bit later on, they took that concept and they made some changes to it, and they came up with another system, and that is the one that we call ATP by filtration. Sometimes we may refer to it as second generation ATP, but really, because of the amount of work that went into ironing out some of the flaws in the first generation tests, it's really more like 12th generation ATP. But no matter what you call it, it's the next step above the highlight pens. So the ATP bifiltration system is a more advanced ATP test. And it was developed because people and companies who were using the Merck ATP pen test, they saw a lot of inconsistencies and a lot of variance in their test results, which is generally not a good thing. And so what they found when they kind of dug into why they were seeing those inconsistencies, what they found was that there needed to be some adjustments or some advancements made in order to iron out the inconsistencies to make the tests more accurate and more consistent in the results that they were giving. And so they developed a way to make these adjustments. They wanted to make for example, they wanted to make a way to change the sample size being used. And they also needed a way to screen out impurities that were commonly found in liquid samples that they found were actually masking results and affecting the accuracy and the consistency of results. So let's talk about, for ATP tests, let's talk about the pros and the cons for this kind of microbial testing versus the other kind, the culture tests and the LFTs that we were discussing before. So number one, already we should be able to see that a big advantage for ATP testing is that it doesn't just give you low results that say low, medium, high. It gives you fully quantified results. It gives you a number. It doesn't give you a low, medium, high. It gives you a number. So it's more specific, it's more quantified. And because you get results back in that kind of form, it makes it a lot easier to do important things like trend analysis over time, trend analysis across different tanks, different locations, anything like that. The kind of results that you get back with ATP testing are going to be make you much more able to do that than if you were trying to do that with culture tests, whether it's Microbe Monitor 2 or Liquicult, or even the LFTs. Okay, so that's advantage number one. Another advantage, another pro for ATP tests is that they are ASTM vetted. Remember, for the LFTs and also for Microbe Monitor 2, they had these ASTM numbers assigned to them. And in the previous episode, we said that that was a good thing. What that meant was that a group of industry experts had looked at these test results, had basically broken them down, examined them as closely as they could, and they had given their stamp of approval that they were valid, good, reliable test results. So the LFTs have that, Micromonitor 2 has that, and the ATP bifiltration also has an ASTM test result, or an ASTM number, excuse me. So that's advantage number two. Speaks to the validity of the method. Advantage number three is an ATP test only takes like 5 minutes to do. Now remember, we said when we were talking about LFTs, about the fuel stat resonate tests, that was an advantage with them as well. Culture tests took days to give you results. LFTs, you got your results back in like 10 minutes. For ATP tests, you get your results back in like 5 or 10 minutes themselves, which is much better than having to wait days to get your results. Another advantage, ATP tests are the most exact, the most accurate of the test results, and they are subject to the least amount of cross-contamination, the least amount of testing variance. And then lastly, the cost, now this is half pro, half con. In terms of the costs associated with doing an ATP test, you have a higher upfront cost because you have to buy the luminometer to do the testing. And the luminometer is a very advanced piece of optical reading equipment, so it's probably going to run you maybe $4,000 or $5,000, something like that. But then the cost to run each test after that is actually lower with ATP testing than it is for almost any other kind of test result. We said that with fuel stat tests, depending on where you buy them from, you could expect to pay, I don't know, $100, $150 a test. Again, it depends on what the retail price is for where you're buying those. For the highlight pens, you can get packs from some resellers. They'll sell you packs that end up costing about $60 per test. So that's better than 100 to 150. But for an ATP bifiltration test, typically you're talking about $20 per test run, something like that, which really is a bargain when you consider how technologically advanced the testing is. So what are the other cons that happen? So we've already said first con with ATP bifiltration testing is it has a higher upfront cost because you have to buy the luminometer. Second con with ATP, specific to ATP bifiltration, it is the longest method in terms of them having the most steps. From a practical standpoint, speaking from personal experience, having run probably almost 3,000 of these tests, inevitably what happens, and also having trained people to do this kind of testing, inevitably what we see is that the first time somebody looks at this test and looks at the steps that are needed to do it, they say, holy cow, that's complicated. And it looks like a lot to start with, but that's usually because of unfamiliarity. Once somebody does it 3, maybe 4 times, invariably they'll turn around and they'll say, "Okay, this isn't as hard to do as I initially thought." So, after about the 3rd or 4th time, the practical complexity of tests is really reduced because you know what you're doing. Another con, um, of if speaking to the cost of the testing, yes, the upfront cost is a lot. You know, pay $5,000 for the equipment to do it upfront seems like a lot, but um, how much of a con, so to speak, that is depends on how much testing you're doing. If you're somebody who's only going to do 2 tests a year, that's, you know, you're going to pay a lot more per test from a practical standpoint than somebody like a private plane manufacturer that requires all of its service locations to do tests on every plane that comes in, which is what some of them do. For those companies, the cost per test is significantly reduced. So for a company that does a lot of testing, or also, and don't undersell this, for companies that really need to have a high level of specificity and to really trust the validity of the test results that they're looking at, especially if they're going to make service decisions based on the results that you're seeing, that cost really becomes more negligible when those other factors come into play. Um, so those are the first generation ATP pens, the culture tests, the lateral flow transfer devices, and the ATP bifiltration. Those are the main kinds of in-field microbial tests that you're likely to find out there in the open market. So we ask the question, how, having discussed the good points and the bad points of each one and how each one works, we come to the big question, which is, how do you know which one is best for you? And maybe we can answer that question by considering how they help, how each one of these might contribute to helping you do something important. Because I do want to make a final point about something that this kind of microbial testing should allow you to do, and that's something that's called trend analysis. We mentioned that briefly earlier in this episode. Um, we want to talk about it a little more because that is a really important thing to consider. So, uh, for all of us that have to manage storage tanks or manage fuel systems, every single tank environment, every single fuel distribution environment is different. And so, ideally, if you're going to do microbial testing and you're going to keep track of your results over time, ideally, one of the reasons that you're going to do that in the first place is not just to tell you if you have a problem right now that you have to do something about. I mean, that's important, but the other big thing beyond that is what you want to be able to do is you want to be able to establish what we call your system's fingerprint looks like. The fingerprint analogy is this idea that just like each one of us has our own unique fingerprints, every tank is its own separate environment. Every fuel system and fuel distribution system is its own separate environment. And microbes grow differently in every single tank across the fruited plain, all, hundreds of thousands of tanks out there. They're all at least a little bit different. And so the logic is that if you have microbial testing, or if you're doing microbial testing using a method that's robust enough and reliable enough, then what you can do is you can establish over time what they call a control interval for your system. And when we say control interval, all we mean is you can define for each individual tank that you're responsible for, you can define how much time it takes for a microbial problem to develop in that tank. Because, like we said, all tanks are different. And not just different as in tanks in Orlando are different from tanks in Detroit, but even like here in Orlando, you could have a tank farm that has 12 tanks of different sizes, of different designs. And so you could have one tank where it has a control interval of 18 months, means once your microbes are starting from essentially a negligible level, it takes 18 months of inaction for microbes to establish and grow and reach a level where you then have to take action to knock them back down. But you could have another tank at that same site. Maybe it's across the yard. And that one might have a control interval of 9 months because each tank is different. So if you are doing microbial testing that again is robust enough and reliable enough, you can actually establish what the fingerprint is for each tank, what the control interval is for each tank. And that helps you make better decisions based on what's actually going on in your system and not just based on assumptions of the aggregate of what's happening in everybody's tank. But in order to do this, you have to establish test results for your tank or for your system over a period of time. You have to do what they call trend analysis. And if you do that, if you establish and keep track of test results for your tank over a period of time, that will help you see how microbial levels change over time in your tank. So, if you do that, then when you treat your tank with biocide, you may know, if you know your control interval, you'll know that you might not have to treat again for 18 months versus this tank over here, you might have to check back in 6 months or 9 months because it's a little bit different than this one. And this is ultimately the best case scenario for everybody that manages stored fuel. So you want to be able to do testing that enables you to do that. So the question then is, which of these test methods that we've talked about in the last 2 episodes, which of these methods best allow you to do that? And having looked at all of them, we would unequivocally say that without a doubt, it's ATP testing. It's ATP by filtration testing is the best one to do this kind of thing. Culture tests are not specific enough in their results. Lateral flow transfer, the fuel stat, they're more specific than culture tests, but they still only give you low, medium, and high designations, which are not really specific enough to help you get really good control interval conclusions. Whereas ATP testing gives you fully quantified results with the lowest amount of variance, and that allows you to make meaningful conclusions when you need to make decisions. So, hopefully, having discussed and gone over all of these microbial tests, hopefully the discussion that we've been having has been helpful to enable you to better understand not just the value of microbial testing in the fuel you have to manage, but also better help you understand the pros and cons of the options that are available to you if you want to prevent problems, or if you think you have a problem and you determine that you need to do testing in order to make sure of what you have to do. So that about wraps things up for today's episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. Thank you so much for spending part of your day or evening with us. Check the show notes at our website, www.bellperformance.com, for links to everything that was mentioned in this episode. Please make sure, if you liked what you heard over the last couple episodes, please make sure to subscribe to this podcast in iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you happen to get your podcasts of choice. And then last but not least, if you liked what you heard, please leave a review of the podcast at your preferred site, because reviews hopefully positive reviews are one of the primary ways that really help people find us. So until next time, I am Eric Bjornstad. Bye-bye, everybody, and catch you next time at the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.